Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for modern Asian history. Today we are going to talk about one of the most tumultuous times in the history of communist China, and that is the Cultural Revolution. So let's get to it. 1949 was a big year for the CCP. The Chinese Communist Party emerged victorious from the Civil War with Chiang Kai-shek and the GMD. Chiang and 2 million of his followers were forced to flee the mainland for Taiwan. Moreover, 1949 was also the year that the People's Republic of China was declared. But now what? What do the communists do now that they're in power? The first 10 years after the victory of the CCP was a difficult time for China. That's because China remained a nation in chaos. Its population was still overwhelmingly rural. Moreover, that population was huge. At more than 653 million people, China was by far the world's most populous nation. Feeding those people proved to be a problem. Finally, China's industry had not yet recovered from World War II. Moreover, despite the CCP's best efforts, private property continued to exist in China. This proved to be a nagging problem for Mao, whose solution was a program that he called the Great Leap Forward. Mao argued that what China needed to do was to rapidly advance towards communism, whether the nation was ready for it or not. The idea behind the Great Leap Forward was something called rapid collectivization. What was collectivization? Well, remember, communism is about the elimination of private property. In the rural areas, private property consisted mainly of land and farm animals. Under the Great Leap Forward, all peasant lands would be gathered together into massive farms. Rather than farming for themselves, peasants would now produce food for the nation. And as I just explained, the Great Leap Forward meant the elimination of all private property. All lands, not just those belonging to rich peasants and landlords, were seized. Even farm animals and small vegetable plots were seized and given to the collective. Collectives often involved many villages and thousands of families. Life on these collective farms was highly regimented and controlled by the state. Communes were divided into brigades, companies, and platoons. Bugles called people to work in the morning and sent them home at night. Moreover, they were fed a steady diet of propaganda to ensure that the correct ideas developed among the population. Here are a few examples of that propaganda. Here is one propaganda poster. And another. And still another. Now you should notice that the message of these propaganda posters seems to be the role of community in providing abundant food for a hungry nation. The reality of collectivization and the Great Leap Forward, however, was something quite different. One problem were the production quotas. Under collectivization, each collective farm was ordered to produce a certain quantity of food, whether it was grain or meat or dairy. Typically, these quotas were established far from the collective by government employees who knew nothing of the local conditions. Thus, these quotas were often too high and impossible for most collectives to meet. Another problem was the advice that collectives received from the government. To increase production, collectives were told to plow deep. In some cases, they went down 10 feet and poured in enormous quantities of seed. To help ensure that these seeds had enough nutrients to grow, they would also dump on excessive amounts of fertilizer. Now, you can see the problem here, I hope. Plants were certainly too crowded together. Most of the fertilizer would then run off and into the water. It was really a disaster. Another feature of collectivization was something involving the birds. For some strange reason, collectives were told that birds spread disease, and thus they were ordered to kill all the sparrows and other birds. Of course, now birds also eat insects. So fewer birds meant that the farms were overrun with bugs that could destroy entire crops. Finally, some areas experienced natural disasters such as floods or droughts that destroyed entire crops, making it impossible for them to meet their quotas. But government planners did not care. Quotas had to be met no matter what the local conditions. The result was an actual decline in food production rather than an increase. This decline in food production led to one of the worst famines in modern Chinese history. To make matters worse, the government took whatever food was produced in the countryside and transported most of it to the cities. This left the peasants with little or nothing to eat. It is estimated that from 1959 to 1962, about 30 million people may have died from starvation. The disastrous Great Leap Forward led to a split in the CCP leadership. Mao continued to urge rapid collectivization despite its obvious failure. Another leading party official, a man named Deng Xiaoping, on the contrary, urged an end to the Great Leap Forward. Instead, he argued in favor of a slow transition to communism. Ultimately, this split became an open one in the CCP. Deng and his allies used the failure of the Great Leap Forward to declare an end to rapid collectivization. They urged a slow transition to communism and began pushing Mao to the margins of the government. Mao meanwhile railed against what he saw as revisionism. Ultimately, Mao's side became known as the leftist or radical side, while Deng's position was the rightist or conservative side. But despite the fact that Mao is now being pushed to the side, he does still have allies in the government. One of those allies, to promote Mao's ideology, published a book titled Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, and this became known as the Little Red Book in China. The Little Red Book became like the Bible for many young communists. It was something they consulted daily. Many young people memorized its words and its wisdom. It also increased Mao's popularity among the masses. Here is just one sampling of Mao's wisdom from the Little Red Book. Quote, "Learn to play the piano. In playing the piano, all 10 fingers are in motion. It will not do to move some fingers only and not others. However, if all 10 fingers press down at once, there is no melody. To produce good music, the 10 fingers should move rhythmically and in coordination. A party committee should keep a firm grasp on its central task, and at the same time around the central task, it should unfold the work in other fields. Some people play the piano well and some play it badly, and there is a great difference in the melodies that they produce. Members of party committees must learn to play the piano well." End quote. Well, I hope you feel enlightened from that comment. Mao's Little Red Book was full of sayings like this. And again, as I said, many Chinese citizens memorized these sayings. And this was proof of their loyalty to Mao. An open split between the leftists and the rightists, or between Mao on the left and Deng on the right, will explode in May of 1966 at Beida University in the capital city of Beijing. A professor at Beida University will paste a poster on the walls outside the university. The poster, known as, quote, "a big character poster," end quote, due to the large letters, criticized the university administration as anti-party or anti-communist and anti-socialist. Mao had the poster reproduced and published nationwide. Soon it was all over China. Within weeks, groups of high school and college students across the country began to form themselves into groups known as the Red Guard. The message of the Red Guard was to praise Mao and his socialist purity, while condemning his opponents. So, who were the targets of the Red Guard? Well, basically, it was any person of authority. This could mean school administrators, it could mean intellectuals, it could even mean members of the leadership in the Chinese Communist Party. Red Guards also looked to root out and destroy what were identified as the Four Olds. These Four Olds included customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. And these were ideas that were connected to China before the communist victory in 1949. In most cases, those suspected of not being true to Mao were simply humiliated. Teachers or administrators might be forced to walk through the streets wearing a dunce cap, for example. In other cases, however, violence broke out. No one knows exactly how many, but it is suspected that possibly up to 1 million people may have died in the Great Cultural Revolution. That included some of Mao's enemies within the party. Several of these enemies were jailed. Others disappeared. Deng Xiaoping was lucky, I guess. He was reassigned to a rural tractor factory for quote unquote re-education. The problem for Mao, however, was once he unleashed the forces of the Great Cultural Revolution, they were very hard to control. In fact, the violence and disorder became so great that China became almost nearly impossible to govern. Thus, in 1969 and 70, Mao restored order by sending in the army to regain control of the Red Guard. The solution was to send the youth to the countryside, and the excuse was that in the countryside they could learn about labor from the peasants. Some 15 million young people were taken from the cities and ultimately relocated to the collective farms. Many of these young people stayed on these farms for decades. On September 6, 1976, Mao Zedong died, leaving behind a country and a communist party in turmoil. This was largely due to the problems of the Great Cultural Revolution, as well as the split within the leadership of the Communist Party. The chaos will continue for the next 2 years, especially after Deng Xiaoping returned from exile. Deng was far from done, however. He in fact will force Mao's appointed successor from power and will assume the leadership himself. With that, China will begin to follow a more moderate path. That path of moderation will completely transform China over the next 3 decades. But that's a subject for another lecture.